Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi ta'ala wabarakatuh, and good day everyone. I am Kamar Asnaida and I am the first reporter of the Group 7, and our topic for today is all about the Filipino indigenous peoples last frontier by Timoy Ronald L. Adamat. So let's proceed on the indigenous people situation international perspective. Hindi lang to sa Philippines, but international. So there are 300 million indigenous peoples living across the world today. So which means they are the descendants of the once free people who lived blissful lives, natural abundance, of rich and colorful arts and culture, of traditional yet sustainable livelihood initiative, of simple tribal people over an environment of peace, tranquility, and commitment. But, sad to say ngayong generation na to is the IPS or the indigenous people never inherited the exuberance of being free and in peaceful existence with their environment. So the coming of the white men or the American people who brought along with them the religion and development capture everything that was sacred for the indigenous people, such as the greed, power, and deceit claim ascendancy over the peaceful indigenous cultural communities to the IPS or the indigenous people who became the target for exploitation. So ang nangyari sa mga indigenous people is naging tenant lang sila or mga squatter lang to their own once sacred own ancestral domain, and worst, they now fear from the extinction in their delimited settlement, which were given daw sa kanila ng mga or provided daw sa kanila ng mga visitors, which are the white mans daw. So, from the snow-capped IPS settlement of Canada down to the Indian reservation in the United States of America, towards the mosquito-infested wilderness of Latin America, from the fleet of IPS rape abodes in the Pacific Isles towards the Aboriginal allotment territories of the Panel, Australia, from the unwelcome sun-baked desert of the Middle East toward the freezing height of the Himalayas, and down to the southeast towards the last IPS or the indigenous peoples frontier of the Philippines. So, the IPS can only cling for a single hope, a peaceful and humble longing for the last-minute understanding, a hope that would mean na ma-preserve ang kanilang existence or their ways of life and the protection of their already delimited environment from the total destruction. So, the IPS century-old resistance to the religious and development aggressors, which fell into deaf ears and dumb hearts, can only echo an urgent warning. Ang warning na yon is the indigenous life is on the critical brink of extinction, and so is the natural environment that sustains it. So, somehow, in response daw dun sa sorrowful plight of the indigenous peoples, gumawa or the International Labor Organization or known as ILO in its conventions 169 in 1989 adopted the measures in the elimination of the paternalistic and assimilationist approach to the IPS, and subsequently the United Nations or the UN in the same year na nag-declare din sila on 1993 as International Year for the IPS. And also, or thereafter, the US also declared on 1994 to 2004 as the International Decade for the IPS or for the indigenous peoples, with the theme IPS, or the Indigenous Peoples as New Partner in Development. But sad to say, or sad to note, na itong mga ginawa nila is wala man lang nangyari. Because everything is only document serving. Noong year 2003 daw, since 2003, we failed to see any concrete of or kung ano man ang pwedeng gawin ng UN interventions to provide real flesh in its pronouncement to evolve the Indigenous peoples as the new partner in development. All we see now are the usual mere relief assistance and curatively military intervention among ethnic people in conflict. Issues on the Indigenous people's socio-economic emancipation, political empowerment, and the promotion of their human rights and rights to their ancestral domains are being left out in the dark to root. So, ibig sabihin parang nababaliwala lang din lahat. Not even in a single preventive effort worthy of mention was ever made to address conflict and situation in IPS, or the Indigenous People Ancestral Domain, as a mechanism to better prepare them as a new partner in development. So, sa summary nitong statement na to ni Tim Y. Ronald dito sa international perspective, na sabi niya, so the superpowers of colonial era who currently maintain the power vote in the UN cannot deny the fact of their responsibility for the Indigenous people's painful past, the current dislocation, the bleak future life owing now the IPS, the equivalence of life once enjoyed by their forefather, the exuberant life of a free people with honor, dignity, and with their inherent rights to their ancestral domains.
Hi everyone! Ngayon ating pag-uusapan ang the Indigenous people situation in the Philippine setting. And by the way, I am Akisa Alawi Baloga. So let's go. So in the Philippines, there are roughly 80 million people. And sa 80 million na yun is 14 million ay ang mga Indigenous people. So ano nga ba itong Indigenous people, no? So ang Indigenous people ay So ano nga ba itong mga Indigenous people? So ang Indigenous people is sila yung mga unang nanirahan sa isang lugar bago pa man ito masakop ng mga colonizers or ibang mananakop. So matatawag natin na sila ay mga native. So ang mga Indigenous people na ito ay nagkalat sa ating 7,107 island in the Philippines. So spread yan all throughout from Luzon hanggang sa Mindanao. Pero masasabi natin na ang mga IPs are mostly nasa Mindanao. Kaya mayaman at masagana ang Mindanao. So, there are mga major tribes, includes the Zamboanga Peninsula, which is doon natin matatagpuan ang Subanen. Sa Northern Mindanao at Central naman isang Manubo, Higaonon at Talaandig. Sa Bukidnon naman ay ang Eastern Mindanao ay ang Bagobo, Mandaya at Mansaka. At sa Southern Mindanao naman ay makikita natin ang mga kapatid nating Dedoray, Blaan at Tibuli. So ang common experience na nararanasan ng mga IPs long before is yung history of exploitation, yung pagmamaltrato at pagkakaroon ng division or hindi masyadong pagkilala sa kanila, hindi masyadong pagbibigay ng pansin. So nagsimula pa lang ito in the colonial area and mas naging worst dahil sa mga lowland settlers. So may mga yung mga Indigenous people na ito is because of this people is naging refuge sila. Their last refuge is resulting to the loss of fertile farmlands, abundant rivers, and their sense of belongings and dignity as a people. So dahil sa mga kaguluhang ito, is ang mga kapatid nating IPs is mas pinili nilang manirahan sa mountain at umalis sila sa sarili nilang or own lands nila. So doon nagkaroon ng refuge. nawalan sila ng farmlands at iba pang mga pangkabuhayan nila. So, there are many problems, issues, concerns, or conflicts that are IPs facing. So, mostly dito is yung pagiging issues on religion, socio-cultural, economic, and political concerns, which is nagkaroon ng dahil dito is mas nagkaroon ng problema ang mga IPs or mga kapatid nating indigenous people dahil sa mas malalang division na nangyari. Ginamit may there are many politicians that using or tinatanggalan ng karapatan ng ating mga kababayan na indigenous people or mga native na tao. So, isa dito isang pagkuha ng kanilang mga lupain or pagpapaalis sa kanilang mga pagpapalis sa kanilang sariling tirahan. So sa religion naman tayo is nung early spread, ito yung early spread ng Islam. Nung 1380 is si Sheikh Karibul Makdum, inintroduce niya ang Islam in Tubig Indangan, Simunol sa Tawi-Tawi. So doon niya una inintroduce ang Islam. And then afterwards is si Raha Baginda, continued Islamic missionary, gi-continue na ito at dito niya din sinimulan or na-establish ang pagkakaroon ng sultanate system in the Sulu, pagkakaroon ng sultan, bai at datu. In the 1470 naman is si Sharif Muhammad Kabunsuan spread Islam along the Pulangi River in the mainland Mindanao. So, itong pangyayaring ito is developed to significantly reshape the relationship among indigenous peoples in the southern Mindanao. And then, dahil sa division of indigenous communities, dahil sa pag-divide nito, the Tarsila narrates how brothers, ang magkapatid na Tabunaway at Mamalu, separated due to Islam. So si Tabunay is inaccept niyang Islam and stayed in the lowlands, which is siya ang naging ancestral or ancestors ng mga Magindanaons. Habang si Mamalu naman is nireject niyang Islam at umakyat siya sa bundok, pumunta siya sa highland, which is siya din ang naging ancestor ng mga Teduray and other upland tribes. So even this event symbolizes the early and religious divide among the southern IP group. So dito din makikita natin na sa earlier pa lang is nagkaroon talaga ng religious divide. So ang impact naman ng Christianization onwards is that ang American is strengthened religious and then the Americans strengthened the religious at inintroduce nila ang Protestantism. So dahil dito nagkaroon pa ng iba't ibang paniniwala, which is the Evangelicans, the Baptists, Angelicans, at ngayon which is a new Filipino founded denomination emerged, mga bagong religion, is yung Iglesia ni Cristo at ang Aglipayan Church. So the consequences rising religious tension is that nagkaroon tayo ng religious intolerance and prejudice, magkaroon ng kaguluhan, ignorance of IP beliefs and practices, the misinterpretation of religious teachings, the religious extremism, also politicization of religion, and the use of religion as a political tool or suppression of the indigenous religion expression. So maraming masamang bagay ang nangyari because of this religion division or dahil dito sa pagkahati-hati ng paniniwala ng mga tao. No? So nagkaroon siya, which is nagusbong ang mga discrimination, ang hindi pagkakaintindihan. At of course, may intindihan naman natin ang bawat relihiyon ay may pinaglalaban. So these factors depend on the division among the three major groups. So itong pangyayaring ito is naapektuhan niya, mas lalong naging divide tayo. Itong mga masyadong naapektuhan is ang Christianism, of course, the Muslims at the indigenous people, which result is that ang IP became more marginalized or mas na-separate talaga sa atin ng IPs because of this confused due to overlapping external religious pressure. So, ang mga IPs natin ay hindi natin sila mas nabigyan ng pansin at naging isa rin sa naging problema natin is yun nga, hindi na tayo nagkaisa or let's say naman kahit hindi magkaisa, nawala yung respeto ng bawat isa sa atin dahil may kanya-kanya tayong pinaglalaban, no? At kanya-kanyang paniniwala. So these are the other pinapakita sa litratong ito ay ang mga discrimination, pagmamanipula using the religion, no? And also because of the religion, also because of your religion, of course, Muslim, Christian or anything is nagkakaroon talaga ng pagiging discrimination or pag-disrespect or what we call this pambubuli because of what you believe. So up until now nararanasan pa rin natin yan. So going down, dito tayo sa socio-cultural, or which is tribal and ethnic conflicts among indigenous peoples. No, the Christian majority and Muslim communities arise from several key factors. A major cause is the lack of understanding and respect for each other's culture, which lead into intolerance of differences. These tensions are intensified by cultural domination, often driven by the majority's group of sense of superiority. This results in discrimination, marginalization, stereotyping, and imposition of their own beliefs under the notion of civilizing or correcting indigenous community. So dahil din dito, mas naging arise ang mga socio-cultural problems natin, which is dahil sa paniniwala natin is mas pinaglalaban natin ang paniniwala natin, and then that leads also to discriminating others, and nagkakaroon tayo ng lack of understanding o hindi pag-unawa sa kanila dahil sa sobrang paniniwala natin sa kung anong pinaniniwalaan natin. And then nawala din dito ang mga respeto ng bawat isa, at also mas naging lumala ang diskriminasyon, mas nagkaroon ng marginalization, ng stereotyping dahil dito, no? So, sa socio-cultural talaga is na malaki ang influence ng foreign influences such as westernized education have also threatened the survival of indigenous tradition, no, creating friction. Moreover is the lack of adequate education and awareness among IPs about their cultural values, rights, and identity. Further contributes to conflict is as it limits their ability to defend and assert their place in society. So mas naging mahirap na ipaglaban ng mga IPs ang kanilang karapatan or ang kanilang paniniwala because of this foreign influences na mas nagiging lamang sila dahil mas marami silang alam at na-invalidate ang mga IPs or ang mga indigenous people. So always despite all of this problem, we should always put in mind that respecting each others is a basic human decency na kailangan natin i-apply sa sarili natin bilang hindi isang maranaw kundi bilang isang tao. So yun po siya. So I guess that would be all, and thank you guys for watching.
Hello everyone, my name is Aljan Namangandatu Yahya, reporter from the Group 7, and I'll be continuing the discussion, and for my part, I'll be discussing the economic struggles of indigenous people. The indigenous people's basic needs for survival have become a desperate cry for justice. Their situation is not just about poverty, but about a long history of exploitation and deprivation. Over the years, their ancestral lands have been continuously grabbed and usurped by powerful individuals, corporations, and the government itself. These lands, rich in natural resources, have been exploited by the transnational and global capitalists, often with the cooperation of lowland Filipinos who benefit from the land's productivity. This has led to severe economic discrimination, oppression, and dislocation, leaving the indigenous peoples without the means to sustain their way of life. Despite being a peaceful people who respect and protect nature, constant violation of their rights have awakened in their centuries of suppressed pain and anger. The birth of the Indigenous Peoples Federal Army, or the IPFA, symbolizes their resistance against injustice and their determination to fight for their dignity. The author calls on all peace-loving Filipinos to act with compassion and help stop the hatred and suffering experienced by indigenous communities through the peaceful and fair means. And now let's proceed to the political aggressions against IP, or the indigenous people. Politically motivated aggressions against the indigenous peoples began with the invasion of the territories during colonization. Their lands were taken by force and their people were subjected to violence, exploitation, and humiliation. The Treaty of Paris in 1898, in which Spain sold the Philippines to the United States, made the situation even worse because the indigenous peoples were never consulted about their own land being treated as property to be sold. Colonial powers further divided Filipinos by using religion as a tool of control. Christianized Filipinos from the north were ordered to fight their Muslim brothers in Mindanao, a situation compared to Roman gladiator games where brothers fought each other while their colonial master watched. This historical manipulation caused deep distrust and hostility between Christianized and Islamized regions, a division that still exists today. Tragically, the indigenous peoples were always caught in the middle, suffering from both sides and conflict. In 1930s, the Philippines government worsened their displacement by promoting the resettlement of people from Luzon and Visayas to Mindanao, called the Land of Promise. This migration resulted in the indigenous peoples losing their fertile lands and being pushed to remote, mountainous areas where living conditions were harsh and unproductive. Let's proceed to the consequence of resettlement and land loss. The government's resettlement program drastically changed the social and political structure of Mindanao. The indigenous peoples who once formed the majority in population became minorities almost overnight. Their ancestral domains were partitioned and sold to settlers through legal means, while their own claims to the land were ignored. As a result, the once stable social and political system of Mindanao collapsed. The indigenous peoples could only watch from afar, from the mountains where they were forced to retreat. As settlers took over their lands and established new communities, political power also shifted from the traditional indigenous people leaders such as Datus, Timuais, and Babaylans to Muslim sultans and Datus, leaving the indigenous politically powerless. The continuing injustices and the brutality of armed forces further suppressed them. These decades of dispossessions and violence led to the civil war in the Mindanao, driven by the indigenous peoples and Muslim struggles to regain their ancestral lands and dignity. Now let's proceed to the Regalian Doctrine and its impact. The Regalian Doctrine, introduced by Western imperial powers, became the legal foundations of indigenous disposition. It declared that all occupied lands automatically belong to the state or the king, disregarding the fact that indigenous peoples had lived on and cared for these lands for thousands of years before colonization. This doctrine gave rise to the Land Registration Act of 1903 and the Torrent system of land titling, which treated land as a commodity that could be bought, sold, and owned individually. These laws completely contradicted the indigenous people's spiritual and cultural beliefs. For them, land is sacred, a shared gift from the God and nature, not something to be commercialized or personally owned. They believe that humans belong to the land, not the land belongs to human. Because of this difference in worldview, the indigenous peoples never developed a concept of private ownership. The Regalian Doctrine, therefore, not only took away their land, but also violated their spiritual connections to nature, destroying a way of life that was built on stewardship, balance, and respect for creation. And for the last part, for my part, the oppressive state policies and their effects. The state's oppressive land and political policies have deprived the indigenous peoples of their primary means of the survival. These policies forced them into poverty, stripped them of their ancestral domains, and gradually eroded their cultural identity. Without land and resources, the indigenous people struggles to sustain their communities and preserve their traditions. This deprivation has led to multiple conflicts and instability, including armed resistance, vigilantism, militarization, and even movements for secession. The lack of government action, or worse, its political indifference, adds to the pain. The indigenous people's continuous appeals are often ignored, pushing them to see armed struggle as the only remaining way to be heard. This situation reflects a dangerous cycle where injustice leads to rebellion, and the rebellion leads to further repression. The discussion calls for this genuine government attention and response to the indigenous people's grievances to break this cycle and finally bring peace and justice to Mindanao. And that's all for my part. Thank you. So, hello everyone. This is me again, Aldrana M. Yahya, and I will also discuss the government initiatives. So, for many years, the government has recognized that indigenous peoples have faced deep inequalities. Because of this, these different agencies were created to respond to their needs. However, earlier efforts often focused more on integrating IPs into mainstream society rather than truly understanding and supporting their unique rights and culture. Now let's proceed to Bureau of Non-Christian Tribes 1903. The Bureau was established during the American colonial period with the appearance of helping IPs, but in reality, it mainly aimed to make the assimilation of IPs easier. The intention was more about control and political convenience rather than genuine service to indigenous communities. So, Office of the Commission for Mindanao and Sulu, 1935. Under President Quezon, this office replaced the earlier bureau. Instead of focusing on improving the lives of IPs and Muslim communities, its main purpose was to strengthen government policies and authority in Mindanao and Sulu. Again, it was not centered on empowering indigenous groups. So let's proceed to Commission on National Integration. The CNI was created after World War II to speed up the assimilation of IPs into the majority population. It is also serve a military purpose because the government wanted national unity during post-war reconstructions. Many IPs saw this as a disregard for their right to self-discrimination. The commission only lasted about 10 years. So, Panamin during martial law. During martial regime, Panamin was created to gain the trust of non-Muslim IPs and prevent them from supporting the rising Muslim secessionist movement. The intention was more political than developmental. Programs under Panamin did not really address IP's long-term needs, and it was eventually abolished in 1984. So, let's proceed to SPDA and Muslim Affairs offices. With the surrender of Major MNLF commanders in 1975, SPDA was formed to help rebuild war-damaged areas in Mindanao. Later on, its responsibilities shifted to Muslim-focused offices like the MMA and later OMACC. These agencies kept changing over time, which also meant unstable and inconsistent support for IPs. So, let's proceed to OMA, ONCC, and OSCC after EDSA. After the 1986 EDSA revolution, the government reorganized institutional support for cultural communities. The previous office was divided into three separate agencies: the OMA for Muslims, ONCC for Northern IPs, and OSCC for Southern IPs. These new agencies were meant to provide fairer and more focused attention to each group. So, let's proceed to issues on representations. A major concern was the lack of IP leaders heading these agencies. Most administrators came from other sectors, and even SPDA never had an IP administrator in its long history. This lack of representation made many IPs feel excluded from decisions that affected their lives. There was hope that the MPDF created in 2003 would finally change this pattern. Problem in equity and empowerment. So the government's long history of not appointing IP leaders sends a negative message. Many IPs feel that peaceful groups are ignored, while only those involved in conflict receive attention. Much of the government's support was considered temporary or band-aid solution. Instead of addressing real issues like social justice, ancestral domains, and human rights, many programs were designed mainly to prevent unrest. So more promising modern policies. In recent decades, the government introduced stronger and more meaningful initiatives. The 1987 Constitution officially recognized IP rights and committed to protecting the cultural integrity and ancestral domains. Policies like DENR, DAW, O2, and the social reform agenda aim to reduce inequalities and prepare the groundwork for fully ancestral domain recognition. So, for Indigenous People Rights Act of 1997 or the IPRA, the passage of IPRA marked a major turning point. It became the foundation of IP rights in the Philippines by recognizing their rights to land, culture, and self-governance. The law also created the NCIP, which unified government efforts for indigenous peoples. President Ramos signed the law in 1997 and later declared an annual Indigenous Peoples Week to honor their heritage.
A pleasant morning to each and every one of you. A Friday morning. My name is Muhammad Yasin Isalit. So since we already learned and tackled all about the life of IPs or indigenous people way back then, my assigned part was to conclude, or the concluding part. So to sum up or to conclude the entire main point or major point of how indigenous people have suffered here in the Philippines and experienced life before the colonizers, indigenous people or IPs here in the Philippines have actually faced nearly 5 centuries of poverty, land loss, discrimination, and the erosion of cultural traditions. And I think that was 500 years ago. For the generation, government actions were either insufficient or driven by interests that pushed them further into marginalization. So, way back in 1972, due to the agony of being poor, dispossessed of land, exploited, and discriminated, a major turning point came in with the passage of the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, or the so-called IPRA. This act or this law marked a real recognition of their rights to a land, culture, and self-governance. And it was actually hailed as a landmark achievement because it finally acknowledges or acknowledged their long-standing grievances. Indigenous people have suffered a lot of struggles, problems. They are being discriminated and exploited, and with the help of the IPRA or the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, these people have their freedom or gain its independency. They have been acknowledged and have their own recognition in the society. So even with this IPRA or the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act have already established, there's a lot of many issues remain unresolved. And with such many issues that is being unresolved, here are the 6 recommendations that the text highlighted. So number 1 is religious animosities can be best carved out through continuing participations in religious dialogues such as Bishop Ulama Conference. So meaning, by reducing religious tensions by involving IPs in interfaith conversation with such conference and their participation, it may helps or it somehow helps to ensure equal footing in peace efforts. So number 2 is economic emancipation can best be fast-tracked with direct economic packages as debt payments to IPs by their former colonial masters. This recommends means accelerating economic emancipation through direct financial problems that addresses historical debts and long-term inequalities. So, number 3 is the socio-cultural conflicts can best be prevented by continuing advocacy on a cultural relativity and progressive peace education among all concerned, the concept of tri-people coexistence and cultural solidarity in the Filipino society. So number 3 says that by education or through education that is promoting or promotes cultural respect and cooperations, it somehow or it actually prevents social-cultural conflicts among the tribe people, which are the Christians, Muslims, and Indigenous people. And number 4 is equity in the appointment in both local and national levels of government be pushed through. Moreover, the IPs must always be represented during peace talks between the GRP and the MILF, or GRP and the CPP, NPA, considering the fact that the IP's ancestral domains have always become the battleground of the warring factions. So, through political representation, it ensures fair representation of IPs in both local and national levels of government, especially in peace negotiations where their ancestral lands are often affected. The 5th recommendation is every Filipino, whether he belongs to the Christian majority, the Muslim sector, or the IPs, must have to build for mostly peace zones in his heart, personal peace within his family, and among his neighbors. So this one is more focuses on the idea of peace zones, which encouraging every Filipino to help build the idea of peace zones, beginning with their homes and communities. So the last recommendation that the text highlighted is the federalism could also be a good catalyst for the emancipation of the IPs from the bondage of poverty through political empowerment. This recommends federalism as an option, exploring it as a potential way to empower IPs politically and reduce long-stand poverty. With all the 6 recommendations that have been said or discussed here, the closing message of those recommendations actually emphasizes the idea of unity, trust, rediscovering the value of diverse cultures and religions. And the vision is for the indigenous communities to become centers of peace, harmony, and development alongside the rest of Filipino society.